He cut her off again, for the 6th time, but what happened next stunned the entire chamber. The air inside the Senate hearing room was already thick with unease. Cameras, word, pens scratched against notepads, and every seat behind the long wooden dais was filled with staffers and citizens who knew they were witnessing something bigger than routine business. Jasmine Crockett, her voice steady but determined, had been laying out her argument point by point. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't flustered. She was deliberate, weaving truth into each sentence like a thread meant to be remembered. And then came the interruption. Ted Cruz leaned forward, his tone sharp, his words slicing through her testimony as though her voice didn't belong in the same room. The cadence was familiar, not just loud, but dismissive. The kind of tone that demanded attention by stomping on someone else's. A few eyebrows in the crowd shot up. Some shook their heads. He had done it before, and now he was doing it again. The first interruption had been brushed off. The second drew quiet murmurs. By the fourth, irritation pulsed across the chamber like static. Now, on the 6th, the frustration was visible in the eyes of those watching. Crockett tried again to continue, reclaiming her space. But once more his voice climbed over hers. There was no mistaking the pattern, an old tactic of dominance. A performance of arrogance. Every time she rose with reason, he cut her down with volume. Every time she built her case, he tore at it with noise. And yet, what lingered wasn't her silence, it was her restraint. Crockett's poise in the face of disruption was its own form of defiance. The cameras captured it all. The flicker of annoyance on faces behind her, the stillness of colleagues waiting for her to respond, the uneasy silence that followed each clash. By the 6th interruption, tension wasn't just in the air, it was pounding in the chest of every witness. People leaned forward, waiting, because it was no longer about politics. It was about respect. It was about who gets to speak, and who gets silenced. And as Ted Cruz prepared to interrupt her one more time, no one in that chamber could have predicted the storm her next words would unleash, because the 7th time would change everything. Millions had no idea they were watching history in the making. Too many, it looked like another congressional hearing, another marathon of questions, answers, and interruptions. But beneath the surface, this was more than procedure. This was a collision of worlds, of values, of what America chooses to be in moments of confrontation. Jasmine Crockett represented more than herself that day. She carried with her the weight of every woman who has been told to be quiet, every black professional who has been spoken over, every public servant who has been forced to fight twice as hard for the same ounce of respect. Her presence, her voice, and her unshaken composure embodied dignity. She wasn't just there to defend a policy position, she was there as a living challenge to centuries of dismissal. Ted Cruz, on the other hand, embodied something equally familiar, the smirk of entitlement, the certainty that his interruption mattered more than her sentence. To his supporters, it was just tough questioning, but to the millions watching online, the arrogance was undeniable. Each time he cut her off, it echoed with a history of condescension, men talking over women, power silencing truth, privilege trying to smother persistence. That's why the air felt different after his 6th interruption. Viewers weren't just tallying interruptions like points on a scoreboard. They were watching a deeper story unfold. The chamber became a stage, and the clash became symbolic of the very fault lines running through American democracy, race, and gender. Arrogance and respect, power and dignity. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. And that, more than anything, is what began to shift the mood. People watching from their living rooms, their offices, their phones on lunch breaks, they felt it. Her restraint was not weakness. It was strength. She was holding her ground in silence until the moment arrived to reclaim it with power. Every time Cruz interrupted, he thought he was reinforcing control. But in reality, he was eroding it. The more he tried to dominate, the clearer the contrast became. His impatience versus her patience. His noise versus her calm. His arrogance versus her dignity. And the American public, restless and hungry for justice, recognized the imbalance. Social media timelines began buzzing even before the exchange had ended. Clips were being shared in real time, with captions like, "Why won't he let her speak? And this is bigger than a debate." The frustration wasn't contained to the chamber anymore. It was pouring out into the digital world, multiplying with every passing second. Still, Cruz leaned in again. Still, he interrupted, convinced the power of his voice could overshadow the substance of hers. What he didn't see, what millions watching online did see, was that every interruption was stacking the odds against him. He was digging a hole, one impatient word at a time, and with each cutoff, each smirk, each attempt to silence her, the tension only grew sharper. Viewers weren't just waiting for Crockett to respond. They were craving it. They were sitting forward in their chairs, whispering to screens, "Don't let him get away with it." What began as a clash in a committee room had transformed into a moment of national drama, because Crockett was no longer just answering questions. She was standing in for every voice that deserved to be heard. But Cruz wasn't done, and each interruption only dug his hole deeper. Ted Cruz has never been a stranger to the spotlight. From the moment he emerged on the national stage, his reputation has been less about quiet leadership and more about spectacle, the kind that earns headlines, enrages opponents, and leaves audiences divided between applause and disgust. A Harvard Law graduate, clerk to a Supreme Court Chief Justice, and celebrated by conservatives as a fiery debater, Cruz built his image on sharp intellect wrapped in even sharper elbows. But behind that polished resume lies a pattern, one of condescension, arrogance, and a relentless need to dominate any room he steps into. In Senate hearings, his style has become almost predictable: lean forward, cut in, raise the voice just enough to create tension, and press questions with the smug assurance that only he already knows the answers. For years, this approach has worked for him. Clips of Cruz lecturing witnesses, sparring with Democrats, and ridiculing policy have circulated among his supporters like trophies. His interruptions are not accidents, they're part of the performance, designed to command attention, to project strength, to drown out dissent, yet too many outside his base. The performance reeks of something else: insecurity masked as confidence. Viewers notice how often he steamrolls through answers, how his tone leans less toward curiosity and more toward dismissal. They notice how he seems to relish not the truth, but the theater of silencing those who challenge him. Past controversies only add to this portrait. Who could forget his ill-fated trip to Cancun during Texas's devastating winter storm, when millions of his constituents shivered without heat or water, while families huddled in freezing homes? Cruz boarded a plane to warmth and luxury, later blaming his own daughters for the getaway. The image of a leader fleeing crisis became a permanent mark on his character. Arrogance crystallized into action. Then there were the 2016 Republican primaries, where Cruz's attempt to brand himself as the intellectual warrior against Donald Trump ended in humiliation. Branded Lion Ted by Trump himself, Cruz was mocked on national television, jeered at rallies, and ultimately reduced to endorsing the very man who had insulted his wife and his father. It was a moment that exposed the gap between his proud rhetoric and his actual courage. The contrast was stark: a man with every credential, every pedigree, and yet none of the dignity when it truly counted. Inside the Senate chamber, this arrogance resurfaces again and again. Cruz sees hearings as stages, not forums. His Harvard pedigree and Supreme Court clerkship are wielded like shields, as if academic honors alone justify condescension. He postures with the certainty of someone convinced his education makes him infallible. But education without respect is brittle, and each interruption of Jasmine Crockett reminded the audience of that truth. Because while he leaned on the habits that once won him sometimes, the context had shifted. America had shifted. The audience was no longer just political junkies tallying debate points. It was millions who had lived through dismissals, who had felt the sting of being silenced, who recognized instantly what it means to be talked over again and again. What Cruz thought was strength read instead as arrogance. What he thought was dominance read as bullying. The smirk, the hand gestures, the interruptions, all of it painted the portrait of a man certain that his voice mattered more than hers. And in that chamber, that certainty began to crack. Because his interruptions didn't silence Jasmine Crockett, they only amplified her. Each time he cut her off, the cameras lingered not on him, but on her composure. The audience saw the difference: his arrogance against her calm, his dismissal against her persistence, his resume against her lived truth. And no matter how sharp his tone, it became impossible to miss the imbalance. Cruz had built a career on the theater of control, but what he didn't realize was that in this moment, the theater had shifted. He was no longer in command of the script. The role he was playing, the confident prosecutor dismantling an opponent, wasn't landing. Instead, he looked like the very thing he had always tried to deny: a man out of touch, more concerned with his own dominance than with dignity or truth. And as the sixth interruption faded into a charged silence, his confidence seemed unshakable. The smirk was still there, the arrogance still glimmered. To Cruz, he was winning the exchange, pressing harder, proving his dominance. But to the audience, both in the chamber and across the country, the opposite was unfolding. Because all of that confidence would collapse in the span of a single sentence. Long before she was seated in that chamber, Jasmine Crockett had been learning how to fight with both grace and grit. She was not born into power, nor did she inherit the kind of connections that ease someone into political prominence. Her story began far from marble hallways and cable news cameras in classrooms, in neighborhoods, in courtrooms where voices like hers were often missing. Crockett's path was carved out of necessity. Raised in a working-class environment, she saw early on how injustice didn't fall evenly. She saw neighbors overlooked, families struggling, and opportunities denied. Those memories weren't abstractions. They were lived experiences that imprinted on her the urgency of advocacy. From those beginnings, she made a promise to herself: if she had the chance, she would be the one to stand in the gap, to speak where silence had been forced, to fight where resignation had settled in. That promise led her to law. It wasn't an easy climb. Law school demanded everything: time, money, energy, and she gave it all. Often while others doubted whether she could make it in a system that was never built with her in mind. But Crockett did more than graduate. She excelled. She sharpened her voice, refined her arguments, and prepared not just to practice law, but to wield it as a tool of justice. Her legal career began at the grassroots level. Not in cushy offices with corner views, but in courtrooms where the accused sat in plain clothes, waiting for someone to see them as human. Crockett became a defense attorney, often taking cases others dismissed as unwinnable. She represented the poor, the marginalized, the ones society found easiest to forget. Each client became a testament to her belief that justice should never be reserved for the privileged few. And each case built her reputation not as someone who sought glory, but as someone who sought fairness. It was in those courtrooms that Crockett developed the composure that now defined her presence in the Senate chamber. She learned quickly that raising your voice didn't always make it heard. Sometimes the most devastating response was calm clarity, a truth delivered with precision rather than fury. Judges noticed, juries noticed, and eventually, so did communities beyond the courtroom. When she stepped into public service, first at the state level, she carried with her not just a resume but a mission. She became known for her willingness to confront injustice head-on, whether it was racial inequality, voting rights, or economic disenfranchisement. Crockett didn't tiptoe around controversy. She leaned into it, knowing that silence had never served the marginalized. Her intelligence was undeniable, but it was her moral clarity, the ability to cut through noise and name what was right, that made her magnetic. Her rise was not without resistance. Powerful interests pushed back. Critics tried to paint her as too outspoken, too bold, too much. Yet every attack only sharpened her conviction. She understood the stakes because she had lived them. For her, the fight was never theoretical. It was personal, tied to the lives of people she represented. And so she kept pressing forward, unshaken. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett was already carrying a reputation as someone unafraid to hold her ground. Colleagues knew she was sharp, constituents knew she was relentless, and adversaries knew she would not be easily silenced. All of that history was present in the Senate chamber during the confrontation with Ted Cruz. Each time he interrupted, she wasn't just standing as an individual lawmaker, she was standing as the sum of every struggle she had endured to get there. Her poise in that moment was no accident. It was the product of years in spaces where she was underestimated. Years of fighting uphill battles where losing composure meant losing the chance to win justice. In her calm, there was discipline. In her restraint, there was strategy. She wasn't intimidated by Cruz's interruptions because she had faced louder voices, stronger opposition, and deeper prejudice before. And yet, this moment was different. This wasn't a courtroom with a handful of observers or a committee meeting tucked into local politics. This was the national stage, with cameras capturing every blink, every pause, every interruption. Millions were watching, many of them seeing in Crockett a reflection of themselves. The student told to be quiet. The worker talked over in meetings. The woman dismissed despite her expertise. Her dignity in the face of disrespect was not just her own, it became theirs too. What Ted Cruz failed to recognize was that Jasmine Crockett had been preparing her entire life for exchanges like this one. The courtroom battles, the community fights, the uphill climb into politics, all of it had forged her into someone who could meet arrogance without flinching. She didn't need to match his volume because she carried something far more powerful, the weight of truth, lived experience, and a mission larger than ego. That's why, as she sat there, letting him interrupt for the 6th time, she remained composed. She knew the real victory wouldn't come in shouting over him. It would come in the precise moment when her words landed so clearly, so unshakably that no interruption could erase them. She had faced tougher battles before, but none with the cameras of a nation watching. The hearing began, like so many others, a procedural exchange, a back and forth of questions and answers. But it didn't take long for Senator Ted Cruz to make his presence felt. The first interruption came almost instantly. Crockett had barely finished framing her initial point when Cruz leaned in, his voice sharp, cutting across hers. His tone carried the same condescension that had defined so many of his performances in hearings past, a tone that suggested he wasn't here to listen, but to dominate. Crockett paused, her eyes steady, her posture unwavering. She didn't match his volume. Instead, she allowed the silence to linger for a heartbeat, forcing the room to recognize the rudeness of the interjection. The second interruption followed minutes later. As Crockett calmly laid out her reasoning, Cruz jumped in again, his words tumbling over hers as if the microphone belonged solely to him. A murmur ran through the chamber. A few colleagues shifted in their seats, some rolling their eyes in quiet disbelief. Viewers at home could feel it too. The building sensed that this wasn't a debate. It was a monologue Cruz was trying to control, yet Crockett remained composed, her expression firm but not flustered. By the third interruption, the tension was palpable. Cruz's impatience grew more obvious, his interruptions less like clarifications and more like power plays. He leaned forward, eyebrows arched, voice dripping with dismissal. Crockett, unfazed, simply waited, hands clasped, letting him expend his energy. Her refusal to be rattled created a subtle inversion, though he spoke over her. She was the one commanding attention. The fourth interruption earned audible sighs from across the chamber. Some of Crockett's colleagues glanced at each other, as if silently acknowledging the disrespect unfolding before them. This wasn't debate decorum, it was spectacle, and Cruz thrived on spectacle. But Crockett's restraint turned his theatrics into self-exposure. Each interruption made him look less authoritative and more desperate to control the narrative. When the fifth interruption arrived, Crockett finally shifted. Not in anger, not in volume, but in her body language. She straightened in her chair, fixed her gaze squarely on Cruz, and allowed the faintest trace of a smile to tug at her lips. The kind of smile that says, "I see exactly what you're doing, and it won't work." That subtle defiance landed louder than any shouted rebuttal. Cameras captured it, and audiences watching at home began to feel a flicker of anticipation. The sixth interruption broke the patience of the room. This time, Cruz barely let her begin before interjecting again. His words, a cascade of dismissals. Colleagues exchanged visible looks of frustration. A few shook their heads. Viewers online began flooding social media with outrage, calling out the sheer unfairness of the exchange. Why was she being denied the chance to speak? Why was he so desperate to silence her? The imbalance of power was stark, and it ignited something deeper in the audience. Anger, and yet, Crockett did not break. Her calmness, now sharpened, now radiant with quiet defiance, only intensified the suspense. With every interruption, she seemed to be storing energy, gathering momentum, preparing for something deliberate. She was not just enduring his disrespect, she was waiting for the precise moment to transform it into her advantage. The chamber itself seemed to lean forward. Staffers, colleagues, journalists, all could sense the confrontation was moving toward a tipping point. Cruz's interruptions had become predictable, almost rhythmic, but each one ratcheted the tension higher. It was no longer just about policy or procedure. It had become a test of composure, a battle of willpower under the lights of national scrutiny, and then came the seventh interruption. The seventh interruption snapped across the chamber like a whip. Cruz, leaning in with that familiar smirk, thought he had set the tempo of the exchange. He cut across Crockett's words yet again, voice rising with that blend of indignation and self-importance that he wore like armor. To him, this was control. To everyone else, it was overreach. Crockett did not meet his interruption with speed. She didn't rush, didn't force her voice into his storm. Instead, she stopped. She let his words clatter into the air, unaccompanied, unsupported, ringing with the hollowness of arrogance. For the first time, Cruz seemed to notice the silence that followed him. It wasn't compliance. It was composure. Crockett folded her hands on the desk, waited for him to finish, and then lifted her eyes. Her voice, when it came, was low and measured, not raised, not strained, but infused with the kind of clarity that slices sharper than any shout. "Senator Cruz," she began, her cadence deliberate, her gaze locked. "I've listened to you interrupt me 6 times, and now a 7th. But interruptions don't erase truth. They reveal fear, and what you're afraid of, sir, is that the facts I'm presenting will outlast your noise." The chambers shifted. Chairs creaked as heads turned toward her. Reporters' pens paused mid-scribble. The audience, those who had grown restless with Cruz's antics, felt a sudden stillness grip the room. Crockett let the silence hang before she continued. "Come from a place where you don't get the luxury of talking over people. You have to fight to be heard. You have to earn it. And you, Senator, sitting here with your Harvard credentials and your rehearsed outrage, should understand that respect is not a gift you can withhold. It's a reflection of your own character." A murmur rippled across the chamber. Cruz shifted in his seat, his usual grin faltering just slightly. His hand, which had rested casually on the desk, clenched against the wood. Crockett pressed forward, her words calm but relentless. "You say you care about truth, but truth doesn't need interruptions. Truth doesn't need to drown out a woman's voice. Truth can stand on its own. What can't stand, Senator, is arrogance dressed up as authority." The blow landed. It wasn't just the words, it was the precision, the refusal to match his bluster with bluster. She was playing a different game, one that stripped his theatrics of their power. Cruz opened his mouth, as if to fire back, but Crockett leaned in before he could seize the air again. "You want to talk over me because you can't debate me? You want to shout because you're afraid of listening? And you want to silence me because my presence in this chamber proves that women, that black women, belong in places your interruptions can't erase." The silence that followed was heavy. For a moment, even Cruz seemed caught off guard. His eyes darted across the chamber, searching for the flicker of support, the nod of an ally. None came. The room was watching him differently now, not as the loud senator controlling the stage, but as the man who had finally been called out in real time. Crockett paused, her face serene. Then she delivered the sentence that would echo far beyond the chamber. "So interrupt me again, Senator, if that's all you have. Because every time you do, the American people see you more clearly, and they see me more clearly, too." Gasps broke the silence, followed by a low rumble of acknowledgement. A few colleagues nodded openly. Some smirked. Even those who might not align with her politics could not deny the sharpness of the strike. Cruz, for once, was silent. His lips pressed together, his jaw tight. He shuffled the papers in front of him, trying to mask the discomfort, but the performance was broken. The confidence that had carried him through countless hearings had cracked. He had been hit not with fury, but with precision, and that wound is harder to hide. Crockett sat back in her chair, unhurried, unshaken. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to press further. Her words hung in the chamber like smoke, visible, undeniable, and impossible to brush away. Across the nation, screens lit up. Clips of the exchange were already racing across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The cadence of her response, the calm precision, the devastating framing, it was cinematic, tailor-made for the digital age. Within minutes, the internet had already turned it into a rallying cry. The silence in the chamber had barely settled when the outside world erupted. What played out on C-SPAN, usually the quiet corners of political television, was clipped, captioned, and blasted into every corner of the internet. By the time Crockett left her seat, hashtags were already forming. Hashtag Crockett might, hashtag 7th time. Twitter lit up first. One post showed Cruz leaning forward, finger wagging, captioned, Ted Cruz mansplaining at level 100. Watch Jasmine Crockett slice him in half with calm dignity. Another, paired with the freeze frame of her final line, read, interrupt her again, I dare you. Within hours, those tweets had hundreds of thousands of likes. On TikTok, edits flew faster than anyone could count. Creators layered Crockett's final line over slow-motion clips, over remixes, even over classic movie scenes. One viral edit showed Cruz interrupting in black and white, with the record scratch stopping just as Crockett leaned forward. The caption, this is the moment he knew. Millions watched, millions shared. Instagram reels filled with side-by-side reactions. Everyday people, young, old, immigrant parents, college students, filmed themselves watching the clip and cheering. One teenager, sitting in a dorm room, clapped as Crockett delivered her take. This is why representation matters, she said into the camera. Another reel featured a Latina mother translating Crockett's words into Spanish for her children, her voice cracking with pride as she explained. Mira, así se lucha con dignidad. Late-night comedy hosts didn't miss their chance either. That very evening, monologues opened with Cruz's interruptions spliced back to back, the laugh track rising as each one grew more absurd. By the sixth interruption, you'd think maybe he was out of material, one joked. But no. Turns out he was just setting himself up to get dunked on harder than an NBA backboard. The punchline landed, but it was Crockett's composure that got the applause. Cable news anchors analyzed the clash with the weight of a turning point. On progressive outlets, commentators framed it as more than this isn't just about Cruz's arrogance, one said. This is about the centuries-long battle over whose voice is allowed in American democracy. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she embodied every woman who's ever been told to stay quiet. Even mainstream papers ran with it. Headlines the next morning blared. Crockett stands tall as Cruz stumbles in Senate Showdown. Editorials praised her precision, contrasting it with Cruz's performance of bluster, but perhaps the most striking reactions came from ordinary citizens. One black veteran tweeted, I served this country, and I know strength when I see it. Crockett didn't raise her voice once, but she carried every one of us in that room. An immigrant father in California wrote, my daughter asked me why that man wouldn't let her speak. Then she watched Crockett finish. She smiled. That's hope. The ripple effects moved faster than Cruz's camp could respond. His office released a bland statement, insisting the senator was simply engaged in robust debate, but the internet wasn't buying it. Every defense was met with gifs of Crockett's.com stare. Her steady voice, her line about interruptions revealing fear, and fear was exactly what people saw. Fear of a changing America. Fear of voices too long silenced, now refusing to yield. Fear of dignity proving stronger than condescension. For Crockett's supporters, the moment was validation. Proof that grace under fire could still win. Proof that arrogance could still collapse under the weight of its own noise. Proof that their voices mattered because she had stood her ground against someone who wanted to erase them by nightfall. The debate wasn't just political commentary anymore. It was cultural. It was cinematic. It was history packaged into 90 unforgettable seconds. But this wasn't just about one debate. It was about something bigger, in the quiet that followed. Long after cameras stopped rolling and the headlines circulated, the true weight of what had happened began to settle. What took place in that Senate chamber was more than a confrontation between two lawmakers. It was a mirror reflecting the choices America faces every day. Whether to raise voices in service of arrogance or in service of truth. Whether to shout over others or to listen. Whether to lean on privilege or to uphold dignity. Jasmine Crockett's response, calm and deliberate, became emblematic of a principle far larger than a single exchange. Her composure in the face of repeated interruptions reminded millions that power is not measured by volume, but by the courage to stand firm when pressured, the wisdom to speak clearly when challenged, and the restraint to allow truth to carry its own weight. Each word she spoke was not just a rebuttal. It was a declaration that dignity could not be silenced, that fairness and respect are forces stronger than intimidation. For the millions watching, the lesson was undeniable. Arrogance may dominate a room for a moment, but it cannot withstand the clarity of purpose. The interruptions Cruz relied upon were meant to unsettle her, to fragment her message, to project dominance. Yet they only illuminated the difference between them. His tactics, rooted in self-assured aggression, clashed with her poise, rooted in experience and moral clarity. And in that clash, the audience understood something profound, that true strength is quiet, consistent, and principled. The symbolism extended beyond politics. It spoke to anyone who has ever been spoken over, dismissed, or underestimated. It resonated with women told to be polite instead of assertive, with immigrants navigating systems that were not built for them, with young people fighting to have their voices heard in classrooms, boardrooms, and communities. Crockett's triumph was a reminder that integrity and composure can turn moments of frustration into opportunities for clarity, for empowerment, for change. Even the commentators who had long debated policy were forced to acknowledge the lesson. This was about more than a Senate debate. One anchor said, "It was about showing a nation what leadership looks like when rooted in respect rather than ego." Analysts dissected her words, noting how her pauses, her measured tone, and her refusal to escalate had made every interruption from Cruz seem petty and unnecessary. It was a masterclass in emotional intelligence meeting moral courage, and yet, the most powerful impact was felt not in studios or chambers, but in hearts. Ordinary citizens watched and recognized their own experiences mirrored in her restraint. The woman who had been cut off repeatedly in meetings, the student who had been dismissed in class, the activist silenced at a protest, all of them saw in Crockett's moment the possibility of turning interruption into influence, dismissal into distinction, disrespect into a stage for truth. It was cinematic in its simplicity and profound in its resonance. Arrogance had a chance to dominate. It had a chance to silence, but dignity did not falter. Truth did not hesitate. And in the quiet aftermath, the lesson lingered. It is not the loudest voice that wins the day, but the one that holds steady when tested, the one that refuses to be diminished, the one that transforms adversity into affirmation, because when arrogance meets dignity, history remembers who stood tall. Ted Cruz thought he could control the narrative, dominate the chamber, and silence Jasmine Crockett. But what unfolded was far more than a moment of political theater. It was a lesson in courage, dignity, and the enduring power of truth. Crockett's.com, precise, and unshakable response didn't just shut down a senator. It reminded millions that respect cannot be demanded through interruption or arrogance. It must be earned through character, composure, and integrity. This confrontation, captured on camera and amplified across social media, became a symbol for every voice that has been spoken over, every individual told they're too loud, too bold, or too different. It was a reminder that standing firm in the face of disrespect is not only an act of defiance, it is an act of empowerment. Every pause, every carefully chosen word, every unflinching gaze sent a message. Dignity wins where arrogance fails. And now, you have the chance to be part of this movement. Witnessing moments like this is more than observation. It's a call to action. Share this story. Let others see that truth matters, that calm courage has power, that history rewards those who stand tall when tested. Subscribe to stay connected to stories that celebrate resilience, fairness, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Every like, every share, every comment helps amplify voices that refuse to be silenced. Because in a world too often dominated by noise and arrogance, standing with dignity is revolutionary. Stand with Jasmine Crockett. Stand with truth. Stand with the courage to let your voice be heard. Subscribe, share, and join this movement because together, we amplify what matters most.